Welcome to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast with your host, Jim Robinson.
Hello and welcome back to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robinson. On this episode of the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast, we'd like to bring back an episode that is very timely for this time of year. The podcast covers the impact white mold can have on your soybeans. I hope you find it helpful in managing white mold and preserving yield. Anyway, here's the episode.
In late June, early July, you drive down the road and you look over a clean, weed-free, uniform soybean field. Now, when you drive down that same road again in August, that once idyllic field is now punctuated by large patches of wilting, dead, and dying plants. You have soybean white mold. What is it? How can you manage it or avoid it in the future? Today, to talk about that with us, we have Jacob Foley. Jacob, can you introduce yourself again?
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me back on the show. I am a product evaluation lead covering our northern regions in the north from Minnesota.
Excellent. So, Jacob, can you tell us just a little bit about what causes soybean white mold and describe its life cycle a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So white mold is a fungus. It's caused by the pathogen Sclerotiorum, which is an absolute mouthful to say. so we really refer to it, it can be referred to as Sclerotinia stem rot, or more commonly just straight white mold. I think if you walk into a farm and say, hey, let's talk about white mold, everyone knows what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But so going to the life cycle, it really starts off infecting your soybeans at the soil level. From the soil, we start off, the infecting bodies come from what's called an apothecia. Apothecia is a small brown to tan colored mushroom. They're pretty small. They can be hard to find. They can be confused with other small fungi that other little mushrooms in the soil, like bird's nest is a common one that you might confuse it with. Mm-hmm. But these apothecia are spore-producing bodies, and they're producing what's called an ascospore, and that's what's doing the infecting on your soybean plant. So those spores are driven by wind, and they need to find a way into your plant. Where on a plant, Jim, would they find a way in?
Typically on plants, specific tissues tend to be more sensitive than others. So in this particular case, it's going to be senescing soybean, the actual blooms themselves, the senescing blooms.
Yep. Blooms. And then you could also, if you have any sort of plant injury, that's another way in. I think that route's not as common, but if you've got a little hail damage, or you've got any sort of driving winds that blow any sort of abrasives, blow sand on your plant and can cause little wounds, that's just another way those spores can get in and infect. So once they're in and they cause their infection, you're going to start seeing the infection pretty quickly, I think, at that point of where those spores get in. That's where you're first going to see that infection pop up.
Now,
and go ahead.
When you initially see that infection, what does it look like when that infection sets in?
Well, that's the thing. From the road, or when you're standing outside your field, on the top of your canopy, you're initially going to look fine. Everything looks just fine. But if you can get down into your canopy, that's where you're going to see the infection. That's where the name, the white mold, actually comes in. You're going to have it's a cottony white mass forming at that infection site. And that's where that name, again, where white mold comes from. It's literally a mold growing on your plant, growing on the stems, the petioles, the pods. That's where that infection comes in. So that infection, what it's doing is it essentially girdles your plant. It takes over the stem on the inside, so that plant can't move nutrients or water up and down the plant anymore. So you're going to rapidly see that plant die off, yellow, early premature death, and you'll probably see some lodging after that. And at that point, you can definitely see from the road where you see that infection has taken place. And further on, so that's in the life of the soybean. After that soybean's been taken over, the fungus is using the plant as a host, right? Mm-hmm. It's trying to continue its life cycle, and it does that by forming, it's called sclerosia. Sclerosia is the overwintering body of the fungus. So you can find the sclerosia. They're small, oblong, they're a dark tan to a black colored body, but it's kind of crude, but they resemble mouse or rat droppings. Mm-hmm. So you can find these little bodies that can be on the outside, they can be in your pod, on the outside of your pod, but more commonly I think they're found if you were to take an infected plant and split it down the middle, you're going to find these little bodies inside the stem, right? And the fungus is waiting for that plant to die. Once the plant dies, those sclerosia are dropped to the soil, or even after you harvest white mold beans, that sclerosia is put right back to the soil. They can start its whole process over again.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
So Jacob, tell me a little bit, what is the impact of soybean white mold? I mean, you said that it girdles the plant, and where can we generally find it?
Yeah, so you can find it really in more of the northern geography, the northern Midwest, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin. You can get down into Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. It was actually first discovered in Illinois, so you can blame Illinois for white mold, I guess. just kidding. But it really comes down to, the yield loss comes down to what percent do you have infected, and the general rule of thumb is for every 10% of plants you have infected, you can see about a 3 to 5 bushel yield loss. Mm-hmm. That's about the main impact of it.
Now, where does that yield loss typically come from? Because you said that the plants can start to die off early. They can also start to lodge. What's causing the yield loss that you actually see?
Yeah. So you can straight up lose beans in the pod. They can be taken over and they're just gone. That the plant maybe didn't finish building that bean in the pod. So you've got really light beans. It's really taken away from the beans, mostly the beans themselves from the plant.
Absolutely. And if you do have enough lodging, you may actually have harvest lost as well, stuff that doesn't make it into the combine.
Mm-hmm, sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. And all of that lodged plants, all of that just kind of builds up the inoculum in the soil. You're just going to see it again and again and again as you plant beans there.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. And as I interrupted you about earlier, I think you were about to say that inoculum in the soil can actually persist for several years, right?
Yes, right. Several years. And a simple crop rotation, 1 year rotation is not going to be enough to have any sort of impact on your future soybean crops. It's going to take multiple years away from soybeans to try and limit the pressure in the future.
Absolutely. So before we get to more of the management of soybean white mold, can you tell me a little bit about what conditions favor white mold? Why do we typically see it in the northern geographies, not necessarily as you move farther south?
Sure. So I think part of that is mainly just the environment, right? Soybean is a fungus. It likes moderate to cooler temperatures and moisture. So temperatures really 80 to 85 and under, and then frequent rain around flowering time and that early pod development. So I think you get those temperatures mostly in the north. You don't see, you stay too warm down south, so that fungus can't grow and infect. And the other thing that happens, we have early canopy closure. That's a really big part. That keeps the soil wet underneath the canopy. That moisture hangs in there, and that really helps push along the fungus and helps it infect your plants.
Now, Jacob, there's a little bit of kind of a dichotomy here, because a lot of those conditions that you just described that really promote white mold growth and infection and basically the severity of the disease are also conditions that can really improve soybean yields overall. Soybeans don't like being too hot. They like, if you close the row, you're going to capture more sunlight, reduce weeds. So how can a farmer manage soybean white mold?
So it really comes down to some of your cultural practices, right? And trying to keep that canopy open for as long as you can. So if you're on a narrow row, and in my mind, narrow row is 22 inches or under, if you're 20 or 15 or even drilled at 7.5, those conditions really help white mold. So you try and widen your rows, get the 30 inch row spacing if you can. Your plant density is another one. I think probably the most common planting population that I run into in the north anyway with farmers is around that 140 mark, even up, plus or minus 10,000 down to 130 up to 150. The guys who are planting, or the farmers who are planting 160 up are not helping themselves, especially if they have a history of white mold. And then your planting date can have an impact. I know it kind of brings up heartburn from 2019, but if you can push your planting date a little later, mid-May or even later, that just helps your timing, right? That white mold's on a clock. If you can take control of that clock and confuse it essentially by planting later, it's not going to have anything to infect, or your canopy will stay open longer. That helps a lot too. And then the last one I think is, and I don't think this happens a ton, but your soil fertility, your fertilizers or manure. I've seen some fields that had manure. Sometimes you had no choice but to get the manure out of the pit and put it somewhere. Mm-hmm. And if you have to follow soybeans on that, there's a really good chance you're going to see white mold following any manure or fertilizers. Let the plant fertilize itself. It takes care of that all on its own, and we should just let it do that. Don't add anything extra in terms of nitrogen anyway. Let it build its own.
Absolutely. So what about from a crop rotation standpoint? You'd mentioned that a single year, going a corn bean rotation doesn't necessarily reduce the inoculum enough to have anything meaningful in terms of reduction of the white mold fungus in the soil. So what can you do rotation wise?
You're going to want to just get away from beans for as long as you can. If you can get away with corn on corn, if you can find some good hybrids that help you go corn on corn. If you have any other crops, you can mix in that rotation. The Dakotas, I think wheat's a lot more of a common crop to get in with that rotation or alfalfa. Alfalfa can be another option, something that you leave in the soil for many years. Anything you can do to get away from soybeans for 3 to 5, even more years if you can, is very helpful.
Absolutely. And it's not like farmers need to do this on every single field. It's only those fields where it's absolutely necessary that white mold has been a limiting factor for multiple rotations. So
and not just weeds, Jim. There are other plants that can still house the inoculum. So weeds are actually kind of another issue that you can see in this. Controlling your weeds like lamb's quarter, ragweed, cockleburr, pigweed, velvet leaf, to name a few. If you can control those weeds, that will also help because the fungus will use those as a host, and it'll just keep its life cycle going. So what can some of our growers do to keep those weeds out of their fields, Jim?
Yeah, so Liberty is a great option to control a lot of those weeds. Those are all broadleaf weeds. Liberty does a great job of controlling them. And if a grower thinks that he needs something a little bit more powerful, then there's always a tank mixture of something like Enlist 1 plus Liberty. Glufosinate does a great job, 2,4-D does a great job, and that'll really help reduce those alternative hosts.
You bet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what about individual varieties? What do we see from individual varieties? Can you make a difference in terms of how much white mold you get based on what product you select?
Yeah. So there really isn't one variety that's completely resistant. I think every soybean is susceptible to white mold. Some are just better than others. Use your product ratings. I think there's a lot of testing being done. This is such a prominent disease that I think there's a lot of testing done. Mm-hmm. And like looking through our product guide, we rate all of our agronomics on a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being the best. So if you've got a history of white mold, if you're going through your product guide, look for those beans that are highly rated. A 7, an 8, or a 9 in our book is a really strong rating for white mold. So if you can find that bean and get it on those acres that are tough, that's a really good option. And then if you can avoid full season varieties, try and early things up. And then look for beans that have more of a narrow plant structure, right? The beans that are really wide and bushy and get the canopy quick, like we already discussed, is not what you're looking for. You want to keep that canopy open a little longer if you can help it.
Absolutely. Is there anything that a farmer might be able to do from a chemical control standpoint?
Yeah, chemically you can use fungicides. Again, there's not one fungicide that offers complete control. There's not a perfect answer out there for what to do, but if you're going to use a fungicide, first off, I think they can get kind of pricey. That can be a deterrent for some. I understand that, but there isn't your only option is to put that fungicide on right when you start to see flowers, and it needs to be a preventative. You can't use a curative to help white mold. Once your plant is infected, it's essentially game over for that plant. There's nothing you can put over the top. It's going to save that infected plant. So your only option is to go with a preventative. That's really it.
Exactly. So Jacob, just to kind of summarize what we've talked about here today, basically white mold or Sclerotinia stem rot is a really common disease, especially in the northern geographies where soybeans are grown. And basically it's caused by a fungus that infects the plant. It grows in the soil, infects the plant through senescing blooms or open wounds in the plant, and then begins to actually girdle the petioles and the stems of the plant, which can then limit water and nutrient transport, and thus causes death in the either pods or leaves or whatever it may be. This can cause yield losses of 3 to 5 bushels for every 10% of plants that are infected, and basically is really brought about by some of those more moderate daytime high temperatures. So 85 degrees and below really favors the progression of the disease, as well as additional moisture that's retained either through a fast closed canopy or a lot of rains during the reproductive stages of the Sclerotia. So farmers can really try to manage this. While they won't be able to manage it in such a way where they just come across with the fungicide and cure the plants, what they can do are a number of cultural and varietal practices that can avoid really the progression of the disease or even infection of this disease. Some of those may be trying to delay in those fields that have historically bad white mold pressure, delaying canopy closure either through wider row spacing, later planting dates, more upright varietal selections, as well as multi-year rotations, whether it's 3 or 4 years corn on corn or alfalfa or something along those lines. Reducing the inoculum through the reduction in host plants, it's a great way to avoid getting a worse white mold problem than you've had before. And if worse comes to worse and you think that you're going to have too fast of canopy closure and things are going to be a little bit too wet, you can use a preventative to try to reduce the overall infection of white mold in your soybeans. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I've got one more that I thought of while you were going through, and it's a small thing, but I've passed this little nugget along. If you do know that you have white mold in a field, try and harvest that area or even that whole field last in your harvest schedule. That those Sclerosia, the overwintering bodies, can get stuck in the combine and get thrown out somewhere else in the field. You can essentially move that infection around if you were to combine that first. Mm-hmm. So try and leave those acres last if you can help it. That's my last nugget for this.
That's a great tip.
Episode.
That's a great tip, but you don't necessarily want to wait too long on them. You just maybe quite a bit later into your harvest schedule, but you don't want to jump in with corn because otherwise you're going to get lodging in those white mold beans. But yeah, that's a great tip, Jacob. So thank you so much for joining us in today's episode, Jacob.
You bet. Thanks for having me again, Jim.
Perfect. Well, as always, be sure to tune in on the 1st and 15th of every month for new episodes. And until then, stay field ready.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. Join us next time to be field ready.
A Hurrdat Media Production.